If one is determined, one can achieve anything in life. Hello everyone, this is Akanksha from Englogger. Today we will start with the story of my life by Helen Keller. This is an autobiography written by Helen Keller, who lost her hearing and vision as a child. She describes how she learned to read, write, and talk with the help of teacher Anne Sullivan. So let's get started with chapter number 1. Before we'll start with summary of chapter number 1, let's talk about or let's come to know about who was Helen Keller. Here is about the author. Helen Keller, 1880 to 1968, who was left behind deaf and dumb after an illness in her childhood. She had achieved whatever a normal person cannot dream of. Her whole life an attempt to do what a normal person with sight and hearing can do. And she did everything, well studied with normal students, got university degrees in normal periods of time, learnt many languages, came into contact with world leaders, wrote her inspiring letters, and became source of encouragement and inspiration to all the physically challenged people in the world. So this is about Helen Keller. Who was Helen Keller? What she had achieved, as she was deaf and dumb because in her childhood she was suffering with an illness, and then she became deaf and dumb. But then also she had achieved many things in her life which a normal person cannot dream of or cannot think of. Her whole life an attempt to do what a normal person with sight and hearing can do. So she had achieved a lot in her life. Let's discuss in the first chapter what all she had suffered in her life. Now we'll start with introduction. What all is there in this novel? Helen's The Story of My Life is one of the most popular autobiographies written by great men all over the world. It gives an account of Helen's struggle with her disabilities to become a successful citizen. It gives us a message that if one is determined, one can achieve anything in life. Nothing is impossible for a person with a strong willpower and a clear-cut goal. So I hope that you have understood a bit what is there in this novel, Helen Keller, The Story of My Life. Let's get started with chapter number 1 now. This is the first chapter. In the beginning of the chapter, Helen recalls her childhood when she was writing her own autobiography, which is very difficult task to write actually, because we need to collect our old memories. So Helen was also facing the same problem. Helen begins her life story with some apprehension. It is not easy to write one's autobiography. When Helen begins to recall her earliest impressions, fact and fiction, everything was commingled. Commingled means mixed up. She was confused that what was fact, what was fancy. So a few impressions stand out vividly, very clearly. Many of the joys and sorrows of childhood have lost their sadness. Helen decides to present only those episodes of her life which seem to her to be the most interesting and important, because she didn't want the readers to be bored. In this paragraph you will also learn about that why Helen was hesitated while writing her autobiography. The reason being that many years before she had written a story and had been accused of intentional plagiarism. Helen wrote a creative story called The Frost King, but discovered that it was very similar to one which had been already written many years before. So this is the reason that why she was not confident, or why she was uh, hesitated while writing her own autobiography. So this is it in this paragraph. Now we'll see in the next paragraph what is there. Here, Helen's birth and family background. Helen was born in Tuscobia, a little town of northern Alabama, on June 27, 1880. Her father was a descendant of Caspar Keller, a native of Switzerland, who later settled in Maryland. One of Helen's Swiss ancestors was the first teacher of the deaf in Zurich. Helen finds it a curious coincidence and remarks, "There is no king who has not had a slave among his ancestors, and no slave who has not had a king among his." It means that we all are equal. If there is a king, he would also be a slave one day, and if there is a slave, he would also be king of his own. Helen's grandfather, Caspar Keller's son, settled in Alabama. He used to go from Tuscobia to Philadelphia on horseback. The charming accounts of his trips were found in letters in possession of Helen's aunt. Helen's grandmother was a daughter of one of Lafayette's, Alexander Morey, and granddaughter of Alexander Spotswood. Her father, Arthur H. Keller, was a captain in the Confederate Army. Her mother, Kate Adams, was his second wife and many years younger to him. So this is all in this paragraph about Helen's birth and her family background. Now here is Helen's early home. Here is the description of the home, the house where Helen used to live. Upon the time of her serious illness, Helen lived in a small house consisting of a large square room and a small one. The house was completely covered with vines, climbing roses, and honeysuckles. The little porch, the haunt of many birds, had many flowers. The Keller homestead was a little way from the little rose bed. Helen's love for nature. Guided by the sense of smell, Helen would find the first violets and lilies. She would find comfort among cool leaves and grass. When she would get in a fit of temper, she found immense joy in the garden of flowers. She would wander there for hours. She was particularly fascinated by roses. Now I'll read all this for you so that you will be able to understand what I have just said. I lived upon the time of the illness that deprived me of my sight and hearing in a tiny house consisting of a large square room and a small one in which the servants slept. It is a custom in the South to build a small house near the homestead as an annex to be used on occasion. Such a house my father built after the Civil War, and when he married my mother, they went to live in it. It was completely covered with vines, climbing roses, and honeysuckles. From the garden, it looked like an arbor. The little porch was hidden from view by a screen of yellow roses and southern smilax. It was the favorite haunt of hummingbirds and bees. The Keller homestead where the family lived was a few steps from our little rose bed. It was called Evie, green because the house and the surrounding trees and fences were covered with beautiful English ivy. Its old-fashioned garden was the paradise of my childhood. Even in the days before my teacher came, I used to feel along the square stiff boxwood hedges. Even in the days before my teacher came, I used to feel along the square stiff boxwood hedges and guided by the sense of smell would find the first violets and lilies. There too, after a fit of temper, I went to find comfort and to hide my hot face in the cool leaves and grass. What joy it was to lose myself in that garden of flowers, to wander happily from spot to spot until coming suddenly upon a beautiful vine. I recognized it by its leaves and blossoms and knew it was the vine which covered the tumbled down summer house at the farther end of the garden. Here also were trailing clematis, drooping jasmine, and some rare sweet flower called butterfly lilies, because their fragile petals resembled butterflies' wings, but the roses they were loveliest of all. Never have I found in the greenhouses of the north such heart-satisfying roses as the climbing roses of my southern home. They used to hang in long festoons from our porch, filling the whole air with their fragrance, untainted by any earthy smell. And in the early morning, washed in the dew, they felt so soft, so pure, I could not help wondering if they didn't resemble the asphodels of God's garden. So now I think you have understood what I have explained to you about this all. What is given in this, that Helen's love for nature and Helen's early home. Now here is that how Helen got her name. The beginning of my life was simple and much like every other little life. I came, I saw, I conquered as the first baby in the family always does. There was the usual amount of discussion as to a name for me. The first baby in the family was not to be lightly named. Everyone was emphatic about that. My father suggested the name of Mildred Campbell, an ancestor whom he highly esteemed, and he declined to take any further part in the discussion. My mother solved the problem by giving it as her wish that I should be called after her mother, whose maiden name was Helen Everett. But in the excitement of carrying me to church, my father lost the name on the way very naturally, since it was one in which he had declined to have a part. When the minister asked him for it, he just remembered that it had been decided to call me after my grandmother, and he gave her name as Helen Adams. So this is how she got her name. Like Helen, being the first baby in the family, was the center of attraction. Her father and mother differed on the question of her name. Her father wanted to give her name, the name of Mildred Campbell, while her mother preferred to name her as Helen Everett, a name after her mother. It was, however, that her father who clinched the issue by naming her Helen Adams. Here we can read about that Helen as an assertive, eager child. Helen was very curious and self-assertive. She insisted on imitating other people. At 6 months, she could say, "How die?" One day, she surprised everyone by clearly saying, "Tea, tea, tea." After her illness, The first word she learned was water, and then she began to walk. When she was a year old, she stood and walked in her maiden attempt to catch the flickering shadows of leaves in the sunlight on the floor. Now here we have about Helen's illness, that the happy days of Helen's earliest childhood were very short-lived. It was in February that an illness came to close her eyes and ears forever. They called the illness acute congestion of the stomach and brain. Then Helen's mother started giving sympathy to her in moments of anger and helplessness. Those were worry moments when she found everything going blurred. Gradually, she got used to her silence and darkness, but the glimpses of broad green fields, sky, trees, and flowers, which she saw during the first 19 months of her life, remained in her mind. So, this is it about chapter number 1. If you liked it, please mention in the comment section that is below. You can do subscribe, you can share my channel, you can do like as well. Stay tuned for more videos for the next few chapters of Helen Keller. Thank you and have a nice day.